The air in the Bau Valley was thick that night, heavy with the scent of jasmine and the metallic tang of blood. In the grandest room of the estate, two cries broke the silence, perfectly synchronized, yet destined for two different worlds. When Lady Esther looked down at her newborns, the color didn't just leave her face, it left her soul. One child was as pale as the silk sheets he lay upon. The other was a shadow, a living, breathing accusation. Her husband saw a miracle, but the midwife, Isara, saw a death sentence. With one trembling hand, Esther chose. One son would be a king, the other would be a ghost. But secrets in this house weren't buried in the dirt, they were woven into the skin. And as the years passed, that shadow didn't fade, it grew. The rejection of Bento was not merely a reaction to his appearance, it was a desperate, calculated act of survival. When Lady Esther looked upon the child, she didn't see the innocence of a newborn, but the ghost of a forbidden passion. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized the boy's skin was a map leading straight to her greatest transgression. She knew that in the cold, rigid world of the Bau Valley, this child was a physical manifestation of a truth that could burn her life to ash. To save her status, her marriage, and her very life, she had to treat her own flesh as a mistake. The command to take him away was the final nail in the coffin of her own humanity. Bento's exile to the slave quarters was the first stitch in a tapestry of lies that would eventually smother the entire household. While the fair-skinned Daniel was bathed in the warmth of the master's approval, Bento was relegated to the cold dampness of the straw. This initial separation was more than just a change of rooms, it was the creation of two entirely different destinies. Esther watched from the high windows, her eyes cold but her spirit trembling with a fear that never truly subsided. She convinced herself that by burying the child in the shadows, she could bury the memory of the man who shared his eyes. However, every time a cry drifted up from the quarters, she felt the sharp sting of a bond she could never fully sever. The midwife, Isara, stood as the silent witness to this foundational sin, holding the truth in her steady, weathered hands. She saw the way Esther turned her head, unable to look at the beauty of the child she had so cruelly discarded. Isara understood that this rejection was not born of hate, but of a cowardice that was far more dangerous. She cradled Bento with a fierce, protective love, knowing that he carried a heavy burden he didn't yet understand. While the big house celebrated the birth of an heir, Isara mourned the loss of a mother's soul in the darkness of the barn. She made a silent vow to keep the truth alive, even as the walls of the estate conspired to suffocate it. As the days turned into months, the rejection became the rhythm of the plantation, a quiet law that no one dared to challenge. Sina Joan walked the halls with a pride that was built on a foundation of deception, never suspecting the secret his wife carried. Esther played the part of the devoted mother to Daniel, yet her smiles were brittle and her laughter often ended in a sigh. She had built a fortress of privilege around her chosen son, but the walls were porous, letting in the whispers of the wind. Every time she caught a glimpse of Bento in the distance, her blood ran cold with the realization of what she had done. The sin of selection had turned her home into a gilded cage, where the bars were made of guilt. This pattern of rejection eventually became a routine that defined the very atmosphere of the Bau Valley estate. Daniel flourished in the light of the sun, unaware that his brother was growing up in the peripheral vision of his own life. The contrast between the two boys served as a constant, silent accusation against the lady of the house and the system she upheld. Esther's soul began to shrink inward, withered by the weight of the secret she refused to name aloud. She had hoped that time would wash away the resemblance, but instead, it only sharpened the features that linked Bento to the past. The rejection was a seed planted in toxic soil, and its roots were already beginning to crack the marble floors of the big house. The silver cradle in the master bedroom became a gilded altar where the family's vanity was worshipped daily. Wrapped in the finest imported silks, Daniel was treated as a celestial being whose every breath was a blessing to the estate. The sunlight seemed to linger longer on his face, illuminating a future paved with inheritance, power, and unearned respect. He was shielded from the harsh realities of the world by thick stone walls and the constant hum of servants. To his father, he was the perfect continuation of a lineage, a pristine vessel for the family name. Yet, this luxury was a shallow fortress built upon the deliberate erasure of his own flesh and blood. Down in the humid shadows of the slave quarters, a different kind of life was taking root in the straw. Bento's first bed was a makeshift basket, but it was lined with a warmth that money could never purchase. While Daniel was surrounded by the cold indifference of duty, Bento was held in the fierce, protective embrace of Azara. The midwife whispered prayers into his hair, weaving a protective cloak of words to guard him against the cruelty above. His world was defined by the scent of wood smoke and the steady heartbeat of those who knew the truth. In the dirt and the darkness, the boy learned a resilience that his brother would never have to master. The contrast between the two boys was a jagged scar across the face of the plantation that everyone saw, but no one named. Daniel's toys were hand-carved horses and painted soldiers, symbols of a world he was born to conquer and rule. Bento's playthings were the smooth stones of the yard and the dry twigs fallen from trees, tools of a survivor's imagination. One child was taught that the earth belonged to him, while the other was taught how to move through it without being seen. This division was not merely about comfort, it was about the fundamental value placed on their very souls. The big house thrived on the labor of the quarters, just as Daniel's status relied on Bento's invisibility. Ezra became the bridge between these two disparate worlds, carrying the heavy weight of justice in her weary bones. She watched as Daniel was taught to read and command, while Bento was taught to listen and obey the wind. Her heart ached for the injustice of the two cradles, one shimmering with silver and the other smelling of the earth. She knew that the fine fabrics Daniel wore were no different than the rags on Bento's back in the eyes of God. Every night, she told Bento stories of kings who rose from the dust, planting the seeds of dignity in his mind. She was preparing him for a day when the silver cradle would tarnish and the truth would finally rise. As the boys grew, the walls of the estate could no longer fully contain the echo of their shared existence. Daniel's laughter was celebrated like music in the parlor, while Bento's joy was a quiet ripple in the kitchen. The physical distance between the master bedroom and the slave quarters seemed to stretch into an infinite, uncrossable chasm. Yet, the air they breathed was the same, and the ground beneath them did not distinguish between the master and the slave. Esther watched the two worlds collide in her nightmares, fearing the moment the straw would meet the silver. She had created a divide she thought was permanent, but the foundations of the big house were beginning to tremble. As the years passed, the physical presence of Bento became a ghost that haunted every corner of the plantation. He was no longer a hidden infant, but a growing boy whose every feature mirrored the secrets Esther desperately tried to bury. His stride was firm, and his face began to sharpen into a likeness that was far too familiar to the lady of the house. Every time he crossed the yard, Esther felt a cold shiver of recognition that no amount of wealth could soothe. She would watch him from behind heavy curtains, her heart racing with the fear that his very existence was an alarm. To her he was not just a servant, he was a living, breathing shadow of a man she once loved in secret. This haunting presence forced Esther into a self-imposed exile within the very walls of her own majestic home. She began to withdraw from the social life of the valley, fearing the keen eyes of neighbors and the whispers of guests. The invitations that arrived on silver trays were ignored, as she terrified herself with the thought of someone noticing the truth. She imagined a visitor glancing out a window and seeing the unmistakable curve of Bento's jaw or the depth of his eyes. Every interaction felt like a gamble, a potential exposure of the lie she had built her entire life upon. Her world narrowed until it consisted only of the hallways she paced and the secrets she guarded with manic intensity. The resemblance between the twins became an undeniable force of nature that the plantation's rules could not suppress. While the house worked to keep them apart, the truth seemed to seep through the floorboards and the cracks in the stone. Daniel moved with the entitled grace of a master, yet even he felt an unexplained pull toward the boy in the shadows. To the other workers, the likeness was a silent thunderclaps that everyone heard, but no one dared to speak of aloud. They saw the same light in the eyes of both boys, a shared spark of life that refused to be extinguished by the master's whip. The air in the big house grew thick with the unspoken, creating a tension that felt like a storm about to break. Esther's guilt eventually manifested as a physical ailment, a constant pressure in her chest that stole her breath away. She saw in Bento's skin color a voiceless accusation that followed her into her dreams and back into the light of day. When she accidentally caught his gaze, she didn't see a submissive slave, but a mirror reflecting the depth of her own betrayal. She fought to forget the past, yet the past had a face, and it was currently sweeping the leaves from her front porch. Every avoidance was a tactical retreat in a war she was slowly losing against her own conscience and the passage of time. Her soul seemed to shrink inward, becoming as fragile and brittle as the old parchment she used for her ignored correspondence. The ghost in the hallway was not just a memory, but a constant reminder that blood insists on revealing what humans try to hide. Even as she lavished Daniel with affection and expensive gifts, the shadow of Bento remained the true master of her thoughts. She realized that by rejecting one child, she had permanently corrupted the love she felt for the other, leaving her hollow. The house was no longer a sanctuary of privilege, but a labyrinth of fear where every turn could lead to a confrontation. As Bento grew taller and more certain in his movements, the lie became a weight that threatened to crush the estate. The truth was no longer a whisper in the distance. It was a silent presence standing right outside the door. The stillness of the plantation was shattered for Izara on a night when the moon refused to show its face. While returning from the flower house, she stumbled upon a thin sliver of light bleeding from beneath the sewing room door. Inside, the muffled sounds of a soul in torment drifted through the heavy oak, pulling Izara toward a dangerous truth. She heard Esther's voice, no longer cold and commanding, but fractured by a grief that sounded like breaking glass. The lady of the house was pacing in frantic circles, her footsteps echoing the rhythm of a heart drowning in guilt. It was the sound of a woman who had run out of places to hide from her own reflection. The revelation hit the air like a physical blow when Esther confessed that God had punished her during childbirth. To anyone else, it might have sounded like the ramblings of a tired mother, but to Izara it was a key. The midwife leaned against the cold stone wall, her breath hitching as the jagged pieces of the past finally clicked. She realized then that Bento's birth wasn't just a biological surprise, but the physical evidence of a forbidden flame. The fear she had seen in Esther's eyes for years was finally given a name, and that name was a death sentence. In that dark hallway, the hierarchy of the big house began to crumble under the weight of a secret. Dona Constanza's voice rose next, sharp and biting like a whip cracking against the silence of the room. She urged her daughter to maintain the mask of deception, insisting that the house must believe the lie to survive. There was no room for mercy or maternal love in the old woman's world, only the cold preservation of the family. She spoke of the master's ignorance as a shield that must be guarded at all costs, regardless of the human price. Azara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air as she realized the depth of the conspiracy. The two women were weaving a shroud of silence, hoping to bury a living child beneath the floorboards. The truth revealed that Bento's dark skin was not a curse, but a sacred memory of a love that defied the law. Izara finally understood that the boy carried the features of Toei, a man whose name had been scrubbed from the history. This knowledge transformed the way Izara looked at the child she had been raising in the shadows of the quarters. He was the fruit of a rebellion, a testament to a heart that had once chosen passion over the safety of status. The injustice of his rejection felt even heavier now that Izara knew he was being punished for his mother's courage. She realized that the entire estate was a theater, and every resident was playing a part in a tragic play. As the voices inside the room faded into soft sobs and hushed prayers, Izara walked away with a burden heavier than stone. She carried the secret like a torch through the darkness, knowing that the flame could either light the way or burn it all down. Nothing on the plantation would ever look the same to her again, now that the mask of the big house had slipped. She looked toward the slave quarters, where Bento slept in his straw bed, unaware that he was a king of a secret. The moon finally broke through the clouds, illuminating the path back to the boy who was the living truth. Izara knew that the balance had shifted, and she was now the most powerful person on the land. The inevitable reckoning began not with a grand explosion, but with the quiet, persistent movement of the truth. As the boys grew into young men, the artificial barriers the big house had erected began to dissolve like salt in the rain. No amount of fine silk or heavy curtains could hide the fact that Daniel and Bento moved with the same rhythm and spirit. The plantation workers watched in knowing silence, recognizing that the blood of the same womb was finally making its claim. It was as if the very ground beneath the estate was vibrating with the tension of a story that refused to stay buried. Every day that passed brought the family closer to a collapse that no amount of wealth could prevent. Bento's presence on the land became an undeniable force, a silent sentinel of a past that Esther tried to erase. While Daniel was prepared to inherit the titles and the deeds, it was Bento who truly understood the soul of the earth. The injustice of their separate lives had sharpened the boy's character into something far more resilient than his brother's pampered spirit. Izara watched him with a mixture of pride and dread, knowing that the blood of truth was beginning to seep through the floorboards. The air in the valley grew thick with the anticipation of a storm that would eventually level the house of cards. The secret had outgrown the people who kept it, and now it had a life and a voice of its own. The favoritism that had once seemed like a solid wall was now revealed to be a fragile and desperate illusion. Sina Jones' pride in Daniel began to falter as he caught glimpses of the dark-skinned boy whose eyes were a mirror of his own son's. The whispers among the neighbors grew louder, turning into a roar of suspicion that even the master's status could not silence. Esther lived in a state of constant, paralyzing terror, waiting for the moment the first crack in the foundation would widen. She realized too late that, by trying to protect her secret, she had ensured its eventual and spectacular revelation. The mask she had worn for decades was cracking, revealing the hollowed-out soul of a woman who had betrayed her heart. In the final hours of the old order, the plantation seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable to occur. The two brothers found themselves standing face to face in the middle of the yard, a moment the entire world seemed to pause for. There were no words needed to explain what their bodies and souls already knew to be the absolute, undeniable truth. The resemblance was no longer a haunting shadow, it was a blinding light that exposed every lie the big house had ever told. The invisible chains that had held the hierarchy together snapped under the weight of a recognition that was both beautiful and tragic. In that single look, the years of rejection were undone by the simple, powerful fact of their shared blood. The fall of the Bau Valley estate was a testament to the fact that life does not need to raise its voice to be heard. When the truth finally rose, it did so with the quiet dignity of a sun that had been hidden behind a long and dark eclipse. The silver cradles and the straw beds were forgotten as the human cost of the deception was finally laid bare for all to see. Esther's sin of selection had not saved her, it had only ensured that her legacy would be one of sorrow and hard-won justice. Bento stood in the light of the new day, no longer a ghost, but the rightful heir to his own story and name. The plantation had learned that while you can bury a secret, you can never kill the life that the truth insists on giving.